Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. This week, the trial of Genaro Garcia Luna began in New York City. Garcia Luna was Mexico's former Secretary of Public Security and who is considered to have been the architect of Mexico's own version of the drug war. U.S. federal prosecutors are accusing him of colluding and collaborating with drug cartels. They say that Garcia Luna worked with the Sinaloa and Beltran-Leyva cartels by accepting bribes, establishing protection rackets, providing sensitive information, arresting rival cartel members, and helping them traffic drugs into the United States. Today we return to the history of drug trafficking, the drug war, and how the United States and Mexico are firmly attached at the hip in this history. My guest for this is Benjamin T. Smith. Benjamin Smith is a professor of Latin American history at the University of Warwick. He's the author of a number of books, including his latest called The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. He spent many years in both Mexico and the United States researching this history, and he also has worked with people who seek asylum in the United States as they try to flee the violence of their own homes. Benjamin Smith, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you very much, Mitch.
Let me begin with the trial of Garcia Luna. He oversaw Mexico's side of the drug war during the presidency of Felipe Calderon. That's between 2006, 2012. That's at least the Calderon presidency. Were you surprised by the charges brought against Garcia Luna of working with the cartels? And I should also state that he's denying these charges. But were you surprised at all by these charges?
Well, I think I was rather surprised that the DEA has actually, and the prosecutor's office in New York, has pushed ahead with these charges. I'm not in any way surprised that he was formerly head of the federal police from 2001 to 2005, and then you're right, head of the public security office from 2006 to 2012. I'm in no way surprised that somebody that high up in anti-drugs policy has been accused of corruption. In actual fact, as a historian, I was struggling today to work out if any of the heads of Mexico's judicial police since the 1960s had not been accused of corruption with a fair amount of evidence, and I couldn't think of one.
So why were you surprised that prosecutors actually brought charges?
Well, I was thinking of a good analogy for this. So I'm not sure if you're a fan of what you would call soccer, but proper people would call football. But some footballers have a tendency to showboat. So classically, Neymar of PSG in Brazil showboats and then gets clattered by some thug of a defender. Now, I think effectively what Genaro Garcia Luna has done has kind of showboated, right? I mean, had he kept a low profile, had he taken his money and not gone to Miami and become absurdly rich, owns a yacht, owns a $3.5 million seaside house, then I think he could have kept his money. But the DEA, I think, like it has for many cartel kingpins, has decided to take him on because he's been fairly high profile.
Any reason why this is happening in the United States and not Mexico? Is this something that would have been impossible to occur in Mexico?
I don't think it's impossible. I mean, a fair amount of... it should be made clear that Garcia Luna has been accused, together with two of his lieutenants in the public security apparatus. Those two people are actually in prison in Mexico, and the U.S. hopes to extradite them. Other federal cops who are under Garcia Luna have already been put away in the United States. So Mexico is capable of doing this. However, corruption trials in Mexico have tended to give much lighter sentences than in the US, even for really large corruption cases, like that of Javier Duarte, who was governor of Veracruz during the early 2010s, and was busted for massive corruption and collusion with a really awful cartel, the Zetas. And yet he only got, I think no more than 10 years in jail.
Do you see any significance in him, Garcia Luna, working with the Sinaloa cartel and the Beltran-Leyva cartel compared to other cartels and even against other cartels? Is there any significance there?
Well, I think there is to a certain extent. Well, the first thing that's worth saying is the Sinaloa cartel is to this day, and has been for the last 30 years, the most powerful federation of drug traffickers in Mexico. So if he was helping them, he did a good job. And still today, it is the biggest exporter of narcotics in Mexico through all the kind of data we have. During the time he was head of public security, there was a much vaunted war on drugs where the federal government, for which he worked, sent tens of thousands of military and cops into the Mexican hinterlands to track down drug traffickers and track down fields of opium and marijuana. Now, during that period, hundreds and thousands of drug traffickers were arrested. I think about 70,000 in total. Now, NPR did a fascinating investigation into this in 2010, and they found out that well over 40% of those who had been arrested were from the Gulf and Zetas cartels, i.e. the opposition to the Sinaloa cartel, and only 12% of those arrested came from the Sinaloa cartel. So it looks in a way that these arrests were made quite deliberately to punish the Sinaloa cartel's rivals. And this accusation that the head of public security was basically backing the Sinaloa cartel would kind of explain that.
Is it the Sinaloa cartel and the Zeta cartels that are the two big rivals? I know this is a complicated story, but is that one way?
So during kind of 2000 to 2010, there were about 5 or 6 major cartels. The two big ones were the Sinaloa cartel, and which basically ran the northwest of Mexico, and the Gulf cartel and its kind of armed group called the Zetas that ran the east part of Mexico. Since 2010, and since really Garcia Luna and the DEA started to arrest vast quantities of these cartel members, those cartels have fragmented. Nowadays, people are talking about at least 12 major cartels and something in the region of 400 separate small-time trafficking organizations. So the system is really fragmented, really thanks partially to this very aggressive drugs war.
And we're going to get into that. I'm using the term, and I'm throwing out the term cartel as though everyone actually understands what a cartel is, because we hear it all the time. I say the word like I actually understand what a cartel means. But you know, we can call OPEC as an example as a cartel, and here we're calling these the drug traffickers cartels as well. What do we mean when we talk about drug trafficking when we say cartels?
Right. So effectively, a cartel should be a kind of corporation or a group of corporations which monopolize price, right, which set prices. As a result, when talking about drug trafficking organizations, it's a total misnomer, because drug trafficking organizations don't set prices. In actual fact, it's massively competitive and they try to undercut each other the entire time. So they are not cartels. But over the last kind of 2 or 3 decades, it's become a kind of de facto shorthand to describe what is much more complex than a cartel. I mean, these are huge commercial enterprises involving, hundreds of different nodes at every level of the drug trafficking industry. They're certainly not hierarchically organized cartels with kingpins at the top, giving out orders and rubbing their stomachs while their lieutenants do the work for them. That's not how the drug trade is organized.
And finally, another question on the trial of Garcia Luna before we dive into this history behind all of this. And he's well connected. I mean, he was the architect of Mexico's drug war. He served under Felipe Calderon. He was the head police officer before that. He's been in contact and knows people I suspect in the FBI, the DEA, CIA. Can this trial lead to some even bigger stories than what this one is? And is this a danger
possibly.
To those who are in power?
It should also be remembered this trial happens 4 years after the trial of allegedly Garcia Luna's paymaster, Chapo Guzman. And during that trial, accusations were made that have not been backed up since then, that Chapo was also paying off two presidents, one Peña Nieto, who ruled from 2012 to 2018, and even there were accusations made in the courtroom, at least, that he was paying off AMLO, the current president of Mexico. So it is possible that similar accusations will come out about people higher up the food chain, and there are very few people higher up the food chain than Garcia Luna.
Benjamin Smith, you begin your book, again, which is called The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade, in 1908. That's where you begin your history. This is with the arrest of Jose de Moral. What's significant about the early 1900s in understanding this history of the drug trade with Mexico and the United States?
Certainly. So Mexico is kind of essential now for a multitude of different drugs, right? From methamphetamine to fentanyl, a lot of these kind of non-organic drugs that are made from precursors. But it started off principally as being a place where marijuana was grown and was used by a very small subset of the Mexican population, mostly soldiers and prisoners who were stuck in either barracks or prisons, couldn't get access to alcohol, and so got high. And during the late 19th, early 20th century, as basically the amount of prisoners and the amount of soldiers increased, so did the use of marijuana. I suppose there is some debate, but in my book, I argue that during the Mexican Revolution, which occurred from 1910 to 1920, there was a kind of big expansion of marijuana use. It effectively became the kind of go-to medicine for your average Mexican revolutionary soldier, often used as a kind of pain relief in the same way that opiates were used in Europe during World War One.
And marijuana was brought to Mexico by the Spanish. It was also, you write, used by more indigenous communities as a medicine, and that it's with this arrest in 1908 in Mexico City of Jose de Moral that suddenly a big outcry against the drug begins. And then you write that it was the outcry which was more significant than actually the drug itself.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one thing that I really want to bring over in the book is that, yes, there is a drug trade in Mexico. There's been a drug trade for the last 100 years. It obviously got worse as soon as America banned drugs in 1914 with the Harrison Act. However, the thing that's really shaped Mexico, perhaps more than the drug trade itself and the vast amount of money that it now generates, is the war on drugs and the panics which inspire the war on drugs. And 1908 was really the first kind of moral panic over drugs. Everyone thought that this guy Moral was feeding marijuana, to their kids, their children at school, to their wayward, young husband or whatever. So there's a big kind of moral panic and an attempt to kind of crack down on this supposed huge network of drug sellers, which in reality, as I said, was really limited to selling to a few prisoners and a few barracks around Mexico City. So all these drug wars tend to be preceded by big moral panics over drugs.
And this is a dynamic that would exist, as you say, ever since. And interestingly, when we think of the history of the drug trade in Mexico and the United States, it's the United States who is always the heavy user of drugs and where the demand is, not really never Mexico itself.
Yeah, so it's another thing. I mean, this is something that I think we've yet to still really understand entirely, but the United States, as we do know, has been since the 1960s the world's greatest user of drugs. So during the 1990s, it took about 70% of the world's cocaine. By the late 1970s, I think 40% of high school children were trying marijuana relatively regularly. So it has a pretty high use of drugs. Now, in comparison, in Mexico, there's been virtually no use of hard drugs until the last 15 or so years. So things like cocaine, Heroin, methamphetamine have been barely used. In the 1970s, the Americans were trying to persuade the Mexicans to clamp down on heroin production. And so they did a massive, I think they interviewed somewhere around 20,000 people, and they tried to find one single Mexican heroin addict, and they couldn't, right? So Mexico has an incredibly low propensity for drugs. Now, a question we could ask is why? Is this some kind of agreement between drug traffickers and the state, i.e. the Mexican state asked the traffickers to export drugs and not sell them in Mexico? Or is it just that Mexico doesn't have a series of kind of social problems which generate drug addiction as they have in the United States? And I think that's really still massively up for debate.
Is that something that we can learn about with this Garcia Luna trial, or is this something that Garcia Luna would know about himself?
I'm not entirely sure. So, I mean, one thing that has happened since Garcia Luna took over public security is that drugs have started to be sold widely in Mexico. So Mexico now does have a fair population of cocaine addicts, methamphetamine addicts particularly, and some at least heroin addicts, particularly in the border regions. So one thing that the very aggressive drug war did by fragmenting these groups is basically eradicate any agreement between the state and the drug trafficking organizations. So these drug trafficking organizations are now quite happy to sell their supply not just to the Americans who pay more, but also to people down the road who might not pay as much, but it's much easier to transport your drugs a couple of streets away.
A lot bigger profit to be made in the United States. You even worked out an economic model of how much drugs somebody would have to produce in Mexico or even grow in Mexico compared to if they were to drive a cab, say, for a year or so.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's something that I think, again, it can appear quite obvious, but it's something perhaps that should be on the headline of every kind of drug story. Is the reason for this is basically economic. Like, on the one hand, America has a huge, unquenchable demand for narcotics, and at the same time, Mexico has a much lower GDP and much lower kind of per capita income than the United States. So you can make the same I think I worked out, driving a cab for a year in Mexico City as selling one marijuana plant in the United States. So why not sell one marijuana plant?
One marijuana plant.
So,
you're making an annual income just on one marijuana plant alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Or I think I worked out on a couple of nickels worth of heroin, right? The incentives are just enormous. And the other thing that I think is important to point out is the war on drugs itself further increases those incentives. So let's say the DEA captures 10 tons of cocaine in one of its huge, well-publicized busts. Now, all that effectively does is increase the street value of cocaine, which in turn incentivizes a load of more Mexicans to get involved in the trade because they know the profits are going to be greater. So every time the drug war is won, in actual fact, it's lost because the price of cocaine or heroin or marijuana goes up and more people are incentivized to get involved in the trade.
So the drug war itself makes it more risky, I imagine, to be involved in the business, but that risk then increases prices, which of course increases profits. So it's a cyclical cycle. It's a cycle that is occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a cycle that the drug war simply makes worse. It simply accelerates.
When does that begin?
So Mexico has had, I mean, as the first example you gave in this first kind of moral panic about marijuana in 1908 seems to indicate, Mexico's had moral panics and crackdowns on drugs really from the early 20th century onwards. But it really starts escalating post 1970. During the 1960s, America has got kind of addicted to marijuana, most of which has come from Mexico. And during the early 70s, a lot of Vietnam vets return addicted to heroin, which again starts to come from Mexico. As a result of that, Nixon particularly starts a very aggressive drug war and focuses it on Mexico. And basically forces Mexico to clamp down on both marijuana and heroin production in the countryside. And by the 1970s, the US is helping Mexico send about 10,000 troops into the countryside, spray drug crops with various kind of Agent Orange-like substances, and generally kind of crack and arrest loads of kingpins. So kind of what we see in the 2000s was preceded in the 1970s. Nixon was first doing this 50 odd years ago.
So I'm just beating a dead horse here, but I think this is a really important point. It is the drug war itself that has helped spread drug trafficking, it sounds like, or at least the what we would witness today and what we're experiencing today, what we're reading about today.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the assumption is that drug trafficking is by its very nature violent. It's not. It's simply a commercial exercise, right? It's you grow something, you process it, you then sell it to somebody who then crosses the border with it, right? It's essentially just a commercial enterprise of exchanging products or exchanging products for money. That's not intrinsically violent. Where it gets violent is when pressure is put upon it. And at that point, traffickers either fight back against the police, or most normally, the police try to turn some of the traffickers into informers. And what that does is basically destroy the bonds of trust between drug traffickers and turn them against one another. So what you see and what is coming out in this Garcia Luna trial at the moment is basically you can see that what are presented as kind of fights between cartels and fights between kingpins are very deliberately manufactured by the Mexican and the US authorities. Because if you have Chapo, for example, the Sinaloa cartel, taking on the Beltran Leyva cartel, then each snitch on each other, each give each other's major people up. Right. So in actual fact, a violent cartel confrontation is fantastic for the DEA and fantastic for the Mexican police, because each cartel is basically snitching on one another. So they get loads of high profile kingpins they arrest, their budgets increase, they get more arms, they get clapped on the back, people do well out of it, people get promotions. Depressingly, yeah, the bloodshed of Mexico in the last 20 or so years has been pretty good for a lot of policemen's jobs.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Benjamin Smith. Benjamin Smith is a professor of Latin American history at the University of Warwick, and we are talking about his book called The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Trade. Benjamin Smith, you spent many years researching this history, including going into the archives both in Mexico and the United States. How did you get to this story about the role that informants played in causing more conflict with within the cartels and between the cartels?
Well, I think kind of there were two ways in. One was talking to DEA agents who talked about how they attempted to dismantle cartels, and they were fairly upfront about it. I mean, cartels are fairly closed off, all cartels or drug trafficking organizations, I should rather say. They're closed off. They mostly comprise family members and friends. How do you enter one of those? How do you take down one of those operations? Because drug trafficking isn't like a normal crime. It's not like assault or robbery. There's no victim. You don't have a heroin addict going into a police station saying, oh, I don't think this heroin's very good, or I think I purchased this for far too much, or something like that. So it's basically, it's an industry that you don't have a victim, or you don't have a direct victim. And as a result, you basically have to infiltrate these very closed organizations. And what the DEA has learned to do Well, initially, what the DEA did for most of the 70s and 80s was something called buy and bust. It would go to the lowest rung on the drug chain and it would buy an ounce of heroin and then it would bust the person for it. Right? The vast majority of DEA arrests in the 70s and 80s were really, really small time. However, by the late 1980s, there was increasing pressure on the DEA to go after what are now known as kingpins, the big fish, not just the small fry. So they start to make heavy use of informants in order to basically disrupt these large drug trafficking organizations. And what this actually does is, as I say, destroy the bonds of trust. And all these drug traffickers think that their friends, their family members are snitching on each other, and these drug trafficking organizations fragment. And that's what you've seen in Colombia, and that's what you've seen in Mexico, is the kind of fragmentation of these drug trafficking organizations into multiple kind of warring bands.
And the scale of violence was unheard of before the 1970s, maybe even before 2000. We'll get to more of a specific timeline here, but especially before the 1970s.
Yeah, so pre-1960, there was almost, I mean, I struggle, I can think of about 2 or 3, and I say massacres, but 2 or 3 kind of major shootouts involving drug trafficking in the 50 years preceding 1960, right? I mean, there was virtually no violence connected to the drug trade. It was only when occasionally fairly large players were mistakenly arrested that violence ensued. Starting in the 1970s, yes, violence does increase, but it's far off the scale of what happened since 2000. I mean, although having said that, currently there is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission looking into Mexico's Cold War, basically Cold War murders, basically dirty war. So the state killed rather a lot of left-wing students and left-wing guerrillas. People reckon somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. Now, according to my estimates, I think about the same were killed during the drug wars of the 1970s. So compared to today, it's a small number. Compared, however, to things like the Dirty War, the 1970s Dirty War in Mexico, it's about the same.
But a significant uptick since starting in the 70s.
Yeah, a significant uptick. Yeah, absolutely. But that uptick then kind of goes through the roof post 2005, 2006. I mean, we're talking about tops about 1,000 killed per year in the 1970s. By 2006, it's kind of nearer 30,000.
The final part of your book is titled Into the Abyss, 1990 to 2020. I lived in Mexico in the mid to late 1990s. I was young and maybe not as aware as I should have been, a bit idealistic, but I traveled a lot through the country, and I never felt to be in danger at the time. And so what I have seen happen in the last 20 plus years since has been remarkable and really scary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to a certain extent, I was also traveling, I suspect, at a similar time as yourself, and also felt extremely safe. And there were whole sections of Mexico, 9/10 of Mexico, which were extremely safe, much safer, I suspect, than most of the United States. Actually, the murder rate was somewhat similar to that of the United States during that period. However, it is important to remember that during the 1990s, 1993, there's a massive shootout at Guadalajara Airport, which kills a Catholic cardinal, as well as some other bystanders. There's a shootout at a nightclub that kills about a dozen people. The presidential candidate, a guy called Colosio, is murdered allegedly by people connected to the Arellano Felix cartel. So there is drug violence happening. And what you also see happening...
And all those are related to drug violence? It's just not political violence? Or maybe one and the same? Or maybe they're connected?
So, I mean, for example, the murder of the presidential candidate Colosio in 1994, there are multiple different theories. In actual fact, I went through 3 huge files of different theories. and this is just a small anecdote, but I found out that a very famous drug trafficker called Amado Carrillo Fuentes, also known as the Lord of the Skies, actually drunkenly phoned up a radio program, I'm sure not as esteemed as your own, and gave his own theories why Colosio had been killed. So there are multiple theories. Some of them are political. Some of them are to do with the drug trade. Others are to do with political protection of the drug trade or the drug traffickers' protection of certain politicians, a kind of mixture of the two. I'm not sure we'll ever really get to the bottom of that particular killing. But yeah, there are drug killings. I mean, I talked recently to the head of the FBI who was working in El Paso during the late 1990s. And by that point, certain drug dealers were not simply trafficking drugs. They were also charging anyone who took drugs through the city that they controlled, basically a tax to do so. And if you didn't pay the tax, you were murdered. So this FBI agent described quite movingly how he came across effectively the first mass grave as early as 1999. It was about, he thinks, 30 to 40 bodies of basically drug dealers who hadn't paid the tax to the guy who ran Ciudad Juarez.
The evolution of corruption in Mexico connected to the drug trade is important, and you're getting sort of to the more current moment of this quote unquote tax that you're referencing. But if we go back 100 years ago, there's still corruption, but the corruption then was very different. You write about Esteban Cantu, who in 1915 was governor of Baja California, and this was very common. He was a part of the corruption of the drug trade. He would collect 3.5 pesos on every kilogram of opium that was brought in from China. But what he used that money for was actually to pay for public works, like building roads and things.
Well, okay, so I mean, thank you for picking that up, and it's quite a big part of the book that certainly up to the 1960s, 1970s, the vast majority, there was a lot of what we would call from the outside to be corruption. Now, what this effectively was local governors, local mayors charging a tax on drug traffickers not to bust them. And you're absolutely right. In the glory years of the Mexican Revolution and the years following, they used this money for pretty, frankly, groovy things that we would nod our head and go, probably worth it. Schools, roads, the good cop that goes down the street and makes sure that, no one's getting shanked for a couple of pesos. However, you're absolutely right. Corruption then does change. By the 1970s, the people in charge of basically collecting the tax on drug traffickers are the police, the Mexican police, and the military. And they are less using this money for groovy schools and roads and much more using the money to basically fund their institutions. So they're buying guns, they're buying uniforms, they're buying they're renting the offices they work in, and they are undeniably funneling quite a lot of that money to themselves. And I think this is something that might be, that is rounding back to the Genaro Garcia Luna trial. I think might be something that comes out. There was, as I said, Garcia Luna is not the first head of the judicial or head of the Mexican police to be busted or to be accused of corruption. And there is no doubt, I think we'll find, that Garcia Luna was using some money from the cartels in order to line his own pockets. However, there's a very good book that was written by a guy called Tony Payan and another woman called Guadalupe Correa, where they do an interview with Garcia Luna. And what is very clear is that he thought, certainly, that he was building up the institution of the police. So one reason that the DEA really liked him is he created this huge, what they called the bunker underneath Mexico City, which was a huge kind of intel gathering unit. To what extent that was almost funded by the drug traffickers' money, who knows? Quite possibly. I don't think all this money went into Garcia Luna's pocket. I think a lot of it went towards the construction of the kind of police arm of the Mexican state.
So again, we're back at this turning point of the 1970s when we not only do we have now an uptick in violence connected to the drug trade, we also have an evolution in corruption and how corruption is working. And you see all of these connected together, and obviously we have the Nixon presidency and the war on drugs. Does all this work together?
Yeah, pretty much. It works together in a kind of complex and pretty depressing way. So you've got the US administration that wants arrests. It's got a Mexican police force that wants money. And it's got drug traffickers that want to traffic drugs. And this becomes a kind of a circular game where effectively the DEA is prepared to put up with a certain amount of corruption from the Mexican police as long as they deliver a few traffickers on a plate to them, particularly the high profile ones, people like Chapo. I mean, there was very recently, and I think this is something that the DEA and the US authorities know. They know that this is a game that they can't win, right? And it's a game with a lot of kind of secondary victims. There was recently a DEA official who was busted for massive corruption. He took somewhere like $9 million from the Colombian cartels. And just before he was put in prison in Puerto Rico, he said the following: "It's not a war, it's a game. You can't win an unwinnable war. The DEA knows this and agents know this. There's so much dope leaving Colombia. There's so much money. We know we're not making a difference. The drug war is a game. It was a very fun game that we were playing." Right? So effectively, that's what it is. But as I say, it has loads of secondary victims. One, it has the victims who are the victims of overdoses in the United States, right? Because this is not really about eradicating. If you wanted to stop people dying of fentanyl overdoses, you'd set up harm reduction programs, right? That would solve it. It has solved it in lots of other countries, okay? For much less money than you pay to the DEA or the military for their kind of supply side anti-drug policies. The second thing, it causes loads of deaths within Mexico. But those are just byproducts of this kind of ludicrous, unwinnable game that the DEA and the Mexican authorities and the drug traffickers are playing.
Makes me think of the nature of conflict. When you have conflict, you have politicians who then end up making their career on that conflict. You have institutions that are then created because of that conflict. And always in the end, and this is where corruption comes in, these politicians, these institutions are then dependent on that conflict still being there in order to justify their own existence.
I think that's entirely correctly put. I mean, I think all these institutions have effectively, they've lived off the drug trade. And since I suppose, and during the 1990s, the US military lived off this, right? I mean, the US military, post the destruction of the Berlin Wall, was threatened with being halved. And it very fortuitously found out that Colombia had a load of narco-terrorists and was funded to attempt to take them down. So, yeah, lots of institutions in the US and in Mexico rely on this. And lots of political careers have been made on this.
We've been talking principally when it comes to corruption, about corruption in Mexico. Is there corruption in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so the other thing that this is something I've been trying to think of, and it's going to come up at this trial, the Garcia Luna trial. How much did the DEA know that Garcia Luna was taking money from the Sinaloa cartel? Quite probably. Did it care? No, because what Garcia Luna, he might have been taking millions from the Sinaloa cartel, but he was also doing what the DEA wanted, which was arresting major drug kingpins and giving them to the DEA. So that's all they cared about. They didn't care about the fact that the heroin overdoses were going through the roof, because they didn't really have to report on that to Congress. They simply had to report on, we've captured this amount of kingpins. So I think, I mean, it's my impression that the DEA knows about this almost necessary corruption in domestic police forces that it works with, and frankly doesn't care. The second thing I think it's important to say is I think there is a tendency within the American media to think that every act of corruption is that of a rogue agent. But the study the evidence that I've seemed to find looks like there is much more kind of institutional wide corruption in America than one might think. And I'll give you a small anecdote that might illustrate this. I went down to El Paso, and I think rather perhaps provocatively, I tweeted, I'm going to be in El Paso at UTEP. Maybe the local DEA and Border Patrol could come along, somewhat jokingly, and kind of tagged them on my tweet. And then I was somewhat shocked to find some burly men at the back of the room when I gave my talk. Now, my talk was fairly negative about the US drug efforts. And at the end of the talk, these burly men approached me, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get in trouble. They say I know nothing. And all three of them said, you were spot on. I've been in this. They were all either Border Patrol or DEA. They said they'd been in the job for 20 odd years. They had 5 left until their pension. They couldn't wait to get out, and they said that corruption was absolutely rife. That it was absolutely institutionalized. It really shocked me. I mean, maybe that is clearly a small sample, the kind of sample that would go and see some weird British professor talking about the drug trade in academic terms. But I think it was somewhat telling. And this guy, as I say, who's currently in jail, former DEA agent accused of taking $9 million from the Colombian cartels, he has made accusations recently that dozens of DEA agents surrounding him were doing exactly the same. And
looking at politicians, and as we were talking about this dynamic of politicians who make their careers on a certain conflict, hence in the end needing that conflict, this all very much lends itself to nativist politics in the United States.
Yeah, sadly. I mean, it's one thing. I think we assume that kind of nativism began with the Trump presidency, but it's certainly been there, and it's been there certainly at the border for many years. And you see it backing repeated attempts to take down traffickers, really from the 1970s onwards. All of, as I say, might end up with a few traffickers on the front page of the El Paso Herald Times, but do very little actually to stop drugs passing into the country. So that kind of nativism has backed a lot of these campaigns, particularly around the border area.
You have worked with more than 100 people seeking asylum into the United States. I think you've been a witness in some of these trials as well. You write about one man at the beginning of your book by the name of Cruz, who was involved in trafficking drugs. Tell me about Cruz, and who was also trying to escape this world and escape the once you try to get out of this world, now your whole life is being threatened, and he was trying to escape that. Tell me more about Cruz.
Well, see, I mean, Cruz is, it's not his real name, but was one of the people that I worked on behalf of. And I met him when he was a scared kind of young parent. I think he was in his late 20s, stuck in a detention cell in the Northwest. And he'd spent a decade in America. He'd got married, he'd had kids. He worked as an apple picker. And he had, however, he had been, while he was in Mexico, some of the village that he lived in was on a drug trafficking route. So basically drugs were taken through his village, and some of his relatives got involved in trafficking these drugs. And in actual fact, he did work kind of as a lookout for them. So when it came to his deportation trial, I made the argument that he wasn't really involved. He hadn't been involved since. He wasn't intrinsically violent. Whereas the lawyer for the DHS claimed that by basically being in some way, by working as a small town lookout as a teenager for his brothers, he was something tantamount to Chapo, and sent him straight back to Mexico, where the enemies of his brother's cartel were looking for him. And I haven't heard of him since.
So you don't know.
I don't know.
He may be in hiding. Something may, yeah.
He may be in hiding. I hope he's in hiding.
Yeah.
But he might not be.
Yeah.
The traffickers have extraordinary. I mean, one thing that I have noticed over work. I mean, we can talk a little bit more about my work with people who are claiming. It's basically Mexicans claiming asylum who are fleeing drug or criminal violence in Mexico and trying to come up to the United States. So, as I say, I've worked for about 150 of these people. Mexicans tend to get a pretty rough deal in the asylum courts. The assumption is Mexico is broadly a functioning democracy. And while I wouldn't disagree, there are a lot of Mexico is functioning. I mean, there's water, there's electricity. They have fairly violent, but if you overcome that, free and fair elections. However, what there isn't is any judicial system. Right, 1% of violent crimes are ever brought to trial. The judicial system in Mexico simply doesn't function. So if you are threatened by a local thug, local drug trafficker, you won't get anything by going to the police. So a lot of these people have given up on the Mexican judicial system and are running to the US because the Mexican system simply won't help them.
This reminds me of Juan Gonzalez's book, Harvest of Empire, which, because of U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America over the decades, that has played a huge role in the people that are now immigrating back to the United States. Here, it sounds like a major cause of people fleeing and looking for asylum from Mexico is the United States drug war, Mexico's drug war. And I mean, if we were to legalize drugs instead, would that make a significant change?
So, okay, I'm going to remind me about the legalization, because I'll definitely come on to that. But first off, you can draw a line, right? You could argue that America's policies have fragmented the drug cartels, right, by taking down all the kingpins and making these kind of 400 gangs that now run Mexico. These gangs, loads of them don't have access to the border, right, because they're down in places like you were living, like Querétaro, right? So as they have no access to the border, they've got to go and get money from other things, right? So they either sell drugs in their local neighborhood or, and what they're increasingly doing, is shaking down people, basically extorting them. So they will break your kneecaps if you don't pay 30% of your taco stall's profits to the local gang leader, right? And that is happening, just like it's happening in Central America, it's happening in Mexico. So you can see a line between American policy and the reality on the Mexican ground. So I think that Harvest of Empire thing is a good analogy. In terms of legalization, I don't think it would do any harm to Mexico, and I actually don't think it would do any harm to the United States. You wouldn't have 100,000 people dying of dodgy loaded fentanyl, right? So I think that would certainly help. But I think there were kind of two things that undermine this. You can't legalize without a proper medical system or system of psychological care, which frankly you don't have in the US. So if you legalize now, it'll be Wild West, right? Without a medical system to go and regulate this, was it 40% don't have access to proper medical care in the US? So, I mean, that legalizing won't do a huge amount. And the other thing is that there are parts of Mexico now where essentially the drug trade isn't really the problem. It's the extortion rackets that are the problem. And so just legalizing drugs, those guys who are breaking kneecaps to get money from taco stalls, that's going to mean nothing to them.
Yeah,
they're still going to break kneecaps to get money from taco stalls. So sadly, it's brought us to a situation where legalization is kind of thought of as a bit of a silver bullet, but I'm not sure that it would really sort out problems either in the US or Mexico now. They've got so bad. It's not like somewhere like Portugal or Uruguay where you can broadly decriminalize certain things, and because it's isolated and has a relatively functioning medical service, that actually works.
Benjamin T. Smith has been our guest. Again, he is a professor of Latin American history at the University of Warwick. He has joined us for a conversation on his book. It's called The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. Benjamin Smith, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
No, thank you very much, Mitch.